The Arctic is in serious trouble, and it turns out that losing Arctic ice has huge consequences. So does what happens in the Arctic really matter for the rest of us?
Yes.
Does an end to Arctic ice spell the end of the world?
No.
If we lose the ice, can we get it back?
Maybe.
And who is this person who keeps answering my questions?
I'm Ella.
Find out the answers to all these questions and more in today's episode. I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And the person sitting next to me today is Ella Gilbert.
Also known as Dr. Gilbs to my friends, and I'm a polar climate scientist, and it's pretty cool to be here, see where the magic happens.
I have a confession to make, which is that the plants behind me don't actually belong to me, they belong to my flatmate. But me and Ella have collaborated several times before. This is the first time that it's been in person. I'm really hyped about it. If you have not seen Ella's channel already, the clicky link should be up here somewhere. And I particularly wanted to speak to Ella today about the loss of Arctic sea ice and the possibility of what we call an ice-free Arctic. What are we talking about when we talk about Arctic sea ice and an ice-free Arctic?
So the Arctic is really, really classic. The perfect example of climate change is like a sad polar bear on top of some floating sea ice. And it's a really perfect indicator of how much we're changing our planet. So the Arctic is completely covered a lot of the time with this floating layer of ice. And it sits on top of the frozen ocean and is really crucial to the Arctic climate.
Now, I happen to know, because my first ever ClimateAdam video was on this topic, that floating ice is not a major driver of sea level rise. When that ice melts, it's not really affecting sea levels, right?
Exactly. Just like an ice cube in your gin and tonic, of course, when it melts, your cup doesn't overflow. And when sea ice melts, it doesn't add to sea levels.
The ice which does melt, which adds to sea levels, is ice sitting on land, because obviously when that melts, it flows into the ocean and it raises things up. But if sea ice isn't changing sea levels, why should we care about it?
Well, the thing about sea ice is that it acts like a giant mirror, essentially. So ice is super white, it's super bright, it's super reflective. And that means that it reflects lots of the sun's energy right back out to space. And that process basically means that the Arctic stays cold, and it also has a really important knock-on impact for weather, especially nearest the Arctic.
So for those local impacts, that's obviously really important if you're a polar bear, but it's also really important for a lot of indigenous communities, people who live in the vicinity of the Arctic or in the Arctic itself. But, you know, maybe people watching aren't polar bears. Maybe they don't care about people who live in the Arctic Circle. They don't have that level of empathy. Well, why should people who have no consideration for the Arctic still care if we're losing Arctic sea ice?
Sea ice matters for all of us because it regulates our global climate, and it also has really far-reaching consequences for weather patterns, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, but also all over the world.
As long as I've studied climate change, which is over a decade now, there's this stat: the Arctic is heating twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Unfortunately, that stat is not true.
If we want to be technical, it's 3.8 times faster than the rest of the planet. And that process where you have this white reflective mirror ice being lost and exposing much darker ocean that absorbs heat is really at the root of that process.
And that actually brings us on to the idea of an ice-free Arctic. What we mean when we talk about an ice-free Arctic is generally an Arctic which doesn't have measurable ice really during the summer specifically. And there's a new paper looking at precisely this question. Can you describe, I guess, what the headline of this study is?
So the main takeaway is that it doesn't really matter what we do now in terms of emissions, because an ice-free Arctic is going to happen, according to this paper, sometime between the 2030s and the 2050s.
When I first saw this paper, I had just this slight sinking feeling, because the paper looks at everything from kind of worst case scenarios to scenarios you could describe as really optimistic scenarios. And in all of them, it finds that you end up with summers in the Arctic where you just don't have measurable sea ice.
Yeah, they tried to match what's already happened historically and try and project that forwards, essentially. And it's In some ways, like you say, it's that sinking feeling because this might actually be closer to the truth.
So this really matters for the Arctic, for the rest of the world. At the same time, it is sometimes described as a kind of apocalyptic scenario. The phrase is often used, a blue ocean event. This isn't a phrase that I actually encountered in climate science from other scientists. You're a polar scientist. Is it something you hear people talking about, a blue ocean event?
Outside of the internet, no.
So in the real world, it's not a phrase that you hear within climate science. I think describing it as an event, I don't think that really describes the physical situation, right?
No, I mean, the loss of Arctic sea ice is a gradual, rapid, admittedly, but gradual process, which doesn't necessarily have this switch where it's on or off. The more ice we lose, the worse it is. We're already seeing huge ice losses, and it's already an event, if you like.
I think a lot of people, when they hear this topic, and especially hear that phrase like a switch, they will be thinking about the phrase tipping points, which is this really important idea in climate science that there are certain parts of the climate which could switch to other modes, and crucially, when they switch to those other modes, are incredibly hard to get back. Is an ice-free Arctic a tipping point?
No, not in my mind. A summer ice-free Arctic is not irreversible in the way that other tipping points that are often talked about are. So you might have heard about the loss of the Amazon or the shutdown of this ocean current called the AMOC. Nice name, catchy title.
I mean, it's short for Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, so I think AMOC is much catchier.
For sure, but the loss of summer Arctic sea ice is not something we will completely shift to a new state in the same way that one of those would be.
And I think a big part of that, the kind of savior from that, is winter sea ice. The fact that in the Arctic during winter, you're not getting any sunlight, and so this whole reflectivity dynamic that we're talking about, that's not playing quite the same role. Given that, if we were able to bring global warming back, which is what a lot of the more ambitious climate change scenarios describe, what would that mean for ice in the Arctic?
Well, the joy of Arctic sea ice is that it grows and forms every single season and then melts away again in the summer, which means that as long as you have those conditions that are cold enough for sea ice to form, it can still keep growing. So even if we reach a point where we have a summer without sea ice in the Arctic, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can never have Arctic sea ice again in the summer. And the following season, it will grow back again. And as long as temperatures are at that point where ice can form, we can have sea ice.
So I guess what this study is showing is that it does seem like something of an inevitability that we will see Arctic summers at some point without sea ice, but it's not an inevitability that we stay in that kind of state.
Exactly.
And I feel like this kind of sums up a lot of how we talk about climate change, which is that there's an incredibly serious situation going on. The consequences of it are far-reaching beyond that specific situation. But often when we hear about that, it's easy to throw up our hands and say, oh, we're doomed, there's nothing we can do. But that's not what the science is showing us.
No, the science is pretty clear that it's never too late to take action, and that every fraction of a degree of warming that we can avoid is a huge, huge benefit to the whole planet.
And actually, speaking of how we often speak about climate change wrong, we've made a second video which is over on Ella's channel, and well, we've not filmed it yet, so I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but Ella, can you describe what we're going to be talking about?
Well, we're going to be playing a game, and we're going to be debunking some common climate denial myths.
Check that out. The link will probably be on top of my face right now. And thanks a lot for watching. Until next time. Bye. I don't think I'm going to use that.